The phone buzzed against the nightstand at 12:37 in the morning, and Nicholas Long felt his heart skip when he saw Christopher Garcia's name lighting up the screen. This had become their ritual over the past 3 months, these midnight calls that stretched into the early hours of dawn, conversations that had started as casual check-ins, but had evolved into something neither of them could quite name. Nicholas reached for the phone with trembling fingers, knowing that hearing Christopher's voice would send that familiar warmth spreading through his chest, the same feeling that had been growing stronger with each passing night. "Hey," Christopher's voice came through, soft and slightly rough with exhaustion, and Nicholas could picture him lying in his apartment across town, probably staring at the ceiling the way he always did when his mind wouldn't quiet down. "I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep. Can we talk for a while?" Nicholas settled back against his pillows, pulling the blanket up to his chin as he smiled into the darkness. "Of course. You know I'm always here." The words carried more weight than either of them acknowledged, hanging in the space between them like a promise neither was ready to examine too closely. "I feel calmer when I hear your voice," Christopher admitted, and Nicholas felt his breath catch at the vulnerability in those words. "I don't know what it is, but talking to you at night, it's like everything else just fades away. All the stress from work, all the noise in my head, it just stops when I hear you. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, how their friendship had shifted into something that lived in the space between midnight and dawn, Nicholas had to think back to 3 months earlier, when Christopher had first started calling him in the middle of the night. It had been a Tuesday when Christopher's relationship with Karen Martin had finally imploded after 2 years of what everyone else had thought was the perfect partnership. Nicholas had watched from the sidelines as his best friend had tried to make it work with someone who seemed right on paper, but had never quite fit the way relationships were supposed to fit. Karen was beautiful and successful, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room, but Nicholas had noticed the way Christopher's smile never quite reached his eyes when he talked about her. The first call had come at 1:15 in the morning, 2 days after the breakup. Nicholas had been lying awake anyway, staring at the ceiling and thinking about things he couldn't name, when his phone had started buzzing. Christopher's voice had been raw with exhaustion and something that sounded like relief mixed with confusion. Christopher had said, and Nicholas could hear him moving around his apartment, probably pacing the way he always did when his thoughts were too tangled to sit still. Nicholas had sat up in bed, fully alert despite the late hour, because this was the first time Christopher had ever called him in the middle of the night, and there was something different in his voice, something vulnerable and searching that made Nicholas's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Nicholas had said, settling back against his headboard and pulling his knees up to his chest. "Da, quote moused." Christopher had replied, and Nicholas could hear the confusion in his voice. "Sorry." Nicholas had closed his eyes, thinking about all the times he had watched Christopher try to fit himself into a relationship that looked right from the outside, but had never seemed to bring him genuine happiness. 11. They had talked until almost 4 in the morning that first night, about everything and nothing, about the pressure to follow a path that someone else had laid out and the courage it took to admit when something wasn't working. Christopher had told him about the relief he felt at not having to pretend anymore, about how exhausting it had been to constantly feel like he was performing a role rather than living his life. The second call had come 3 nights later, this time at midnight exactly, as if Christopher had been watching the clock and waiting for the world to quiet down enough for him to think clearly. This time his voice had been softer, more contemplative, and Nicholas had found himself settling into what was becoming a familiar rhythm. "I've been thinking about what you said," Christopher had begun without preamble, and Nicholas had smiled because this was so typically Christopher, jumping into the middle of a conversation as if they had been talking all day. About how sometimes we know things before we're ready to know them. Nicholas had been making tea in his kitchen, moving quietly through the motions while he listened to Christopher's voice through the phone pressed between his ear and shoulder. Christopher had said, and Nicholas could hear the frustration in his voice, the way it always sounded when he was trying to work through something complicated. Nicholas had poured hot water over his tea bag, watching the steam rise in the dim light of his kitchen, and had felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of something he had been carrying for longer than he wanted to admit. Christopher had continued, his voice growing softer, more uncertain. Nicholas had carried his tea back to his bedroom, settling into the chair by his window where he could look out at the city lights while they talked. Quote 20 Iden, quote Chano. Nicholas had remembered that afternoon perfectly, the way the light had filtered through the bookstore windows and caught in Christopher's hair, the way he had looked when Nicholas had read him Mary Oliver's words about the wild geese and finding your place in the world. Christopher had said, his voice so quiet that Nicholas had to strain to hear him. Kotubarn. The calls had continued every night after that, each one lasting a little longer than the last, each conversation digging a little deeper into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. Christopher would call at midnight or just after, and they would talk until one of them finally fell asleep with the phone still pressed to their ear. Nicholas had started looking forward to these conversations in a way that scared him, marking time by the hours until he would hear Christopher's voice again. During the day, they maintained their usual friendship, meeting for coffee or lunch, texting about work and random thoughts. But there was an undercurrent now that hadn't been there before. Nicholas found himself studying Christopher's face when he thought he wasn't looking, noticing things he had somehow missed before. The way Christopher's eyes would linger on him sometimes. The way their conversations during the day felt like they were dancing around something neither of them was ready to name. It was during their fourth week of midnight calls that Christopher had said something that had made Nicholas's heart stop completely. October 25, Christopher had said, his voice barely above a whisper, and Nicholas had felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. 0-6. Nicholas had gripped his phone tighter, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Christopher could hear it through the line. Quote, Twatcher, quote, could it? Christopher had replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he had an idea, even if he wasn't ready to voice it. But I keep thinking about it, about how right it felt. The conversation that had changed everything had happened on a Thursday night in late November, 2 months into their ritual of midnight calls. Christopher had sounded different that night, more agitated, like he had been building up to something all day and was finally ready to let it out. Nicholas, he had said, and the way he said his name, with so much weight and meaning packed into those 3 syllables, had made Nicholas sit up straighter in his bed. Can I ask you something, and will you promise to give me an honest answer? Always, Nicholas had replied, though his heart was racing with anticipation and fear. Have you ever thought about us? I mean, really thought about us, about what we are to each other? Nicholas had closed his eyes, knowing that this was the moment he had been both hoping for and dreading for months. What do you mean? I mean, Christopher had said, his voice gaining strength, I've been thinking about why I feel so calm when I talk to you, why these calls have become the best part of my day. I've been thinking about why I was never really happy with Karen, why I always felt like something was missing, and I keep coming back to you. Christopher, Nicholas had whispered, not sure if it was a warning or an encouragement. I think I'm falling in love with you, Christopher had said in a rush, the words tumbling out like he had been holding them back for too long. I think maybe I've been in love with you for a while, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. And I think that's why nothing else has ever felt right, because I was looking for you in all the wrong places. Nicholas had felt tears spring to his eyes, a mixture of relief and terror and joy so intense it had taken his breath away. I've been in love with you for 2 years, he had whispered back. I've been waiting for you to figure it out. The silence that had followed had been deafening, and Nicholas had held his breath, wondering if he had said too much, if he had ruined everything. But then Christopher had laughed, a sound of pure relief and wonder. 2 years? Christopher had asked, and Nicholas could hear the smile in his voice. God, I'm an idiot. You're not an idiot, Nicholas had said, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. You just needed time to understand what you were feeling. I want to see you, Christopher had said suddenly. I know it's late, but I want to see your face when I tell you that I love you. Nicholas had looked at the clock, seeing that it was past 1 in the morning, but he had already been reaching for his clothes. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Christopher's apartment had felt like the longest 20 minutes of Nicholas's life, his heart pounding with anticipation and nerves. When Christopher had opened the door, they had stared at each other for a long moment, both of them seeming to realize that everything was about to change. Hi, Christopher had said softly, and Nicholas had seen his own feelings reflected in Christopher's eyes, the same mixture of love and fear and hope. Quote 50. Nicholas had replied, stepping into the apartment and closing the door behind him. They had stood in Christopher's living room, facing each other with 3 feet of space between them that felt like an ocean. Christopher had been wearing pajama pants and an old t-shirt, his hair messy from running his hands through it, and Nicholas had thought he had never looked more beautiful. "I love you," Christopher had said, the words clear and certain this time, and Nicholas had felt his heart expand in his chest. "I love you too," Nicholas had replied, and then Christopher had crossed the space between them in 2 quick steps, cupping Nicholas's face in his hands. Quote 53. Christopher had asked, his thumbs brushing across Nicholas's cheekbones, and Nicholas had nodded, not trusting his voice. The kiss had been everything Nicholas had imagined, and more. Soft and tentative at first, then deeper as they both realized that this was real, that they were finally allowing themselves to have what they had both wanted for so long. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Christopher had rested his forehead against Nicholas's. Quote 54. Christopher had whispered. Quote 55. Nicholas had smiled, his hands coming up to cover Christopher's where they still cupped his face. "It does." They had spent the rest of the night talking, curled together on Christopher's couch, sharing stories and fears and dreams for the future. Christopher had told him about the moment he had realized he was in love, how it had hit him during one of their midnight calls when Nicholas had been telling him about a book he was reading, and Christopher had realized that he could listen to Nicholas's voice forever and never get tired of it. Nicholas had told him about the 2 years of loving him in silence, about watching him with Karen and trying to be happy for him while his heart was breaking, about the relief he had felt when Christopher had started calling him at midnight, like maybe there was hope after all. As the sun had started to rise, painting Christopher's living room in soft golden light, they had made promises to each other. To take things slowly, to be patient with themselves and each other as they figured out this new dynamic, to be honest about their fears and hopes. Quote 57. Christopher had admitted as they lay together on the couch, Nicholas's head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I've never felt this way about anyone before, man or woman. What if I'm not good at this?" Nicholas had lifted his head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in Christopher's eyes. Quote 59. The past month since that night had been a revelation for both of them. They had taken things slowly, as promised, spending their days together as friends and their nights exploring this new dimension of their relationship. The midnight calls had continued, but now they were love calls, soft conversations between two people who had finally found what they had been looking for. Christopher had been amazed at how natural it felt, being with Nicholas this way. He had worried that it would be awkward or strange, but instead it felt like the most obvious thing in the world, like he had finally stopped fighting against his own nature and allowed himself to be who he really was. Nicholas had been patient and understanding, never pushing Christopher faster than he was ready to go, always reassuring him that there was no timeline they had to follow, no expectations he had to meet. When Christopher had moments of doubt or confusion, Nicholas was there to remind him that love was love, regardless of gender, and that what they had was real and valid and beautiful. They had told their families and close friends about their relationship, and while there had been some surprise, the response had been largely positive. Christopher's sister Joyce had laughed and said she had been wondering when he was going to figure it out, and Nicholas's mother had simply smiled and said she was happy that her son had found someone who made him glow the way Christopher did. The midnight calls had evolved too, becoming less about confusion and uncertainty and more about planning their future together. They talked about moving in together, about traveling, about all the ways they wanted to build a life that reflected who they really were, rather than who they thought they should be. Christopher had started therapy to work through some of his internalized fears about his sexuality, and Nicholas had been nothing but supportive, driving him to appointments and then listening when he needed to process what he was learning about himself. Christopher was discovering that his attraction to Nicholas wasn't an anomaly or a phase, but rather a part of himself that he had been suppressing for years without even realizing it. "I think I've always known on some level," Christopher had told Nicholas one night as they lay in bed together, Nicholas's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Christopher's chest. I think that's why I was never really happy with women. Why I always felt like I was playing a role. I was looking for something I could only find with you." Nicholas had smiled, pressing a soft kiss to Christopher's collarbone. Quote 62. Their physical relationship had developed naturally, without pressure or expectations. They had shared their first kiss that night in Christopher's living room, and since then, they had been exploring the ways their bodies fit together, the comfort they found in each other's arms. Christopher had been surprised at how right it felt, touching Nicholas, being touched by him, how different it was from anything he had experienced before. Quote 63. Christopher had told Nicholas one evening as they cooked dinner together in Nicholas's kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity and growing intimacy. Like, I've been trying to fit into clothes that were the wrong size my whole life, and now I finally found something that fits perfectly. Nicholas had turned from the stove to smile at him, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind Christopher's ear. Borsasina, the midnight calls had become a sacred time for them. Even when they were together physically, they would lie in bed, phones pressed between them, talking softly about their days, their dreams, their fears. It had become their way of staying connected to the intimacy that had brought them together, a reminder of how their love had begun in those quiet hours when the rest of the world was asleep. Quote 66, Christopher would tell Nicholas, even when they were lying side by side, and Nicholas would smile and press closer, understanding that the calls had become more than just conversations. They were a symbol of the trust they had built, the vulnerability they had shared, the love that had grown from friendship into something deeper and more lasting. Tonight, as Nicholas answered Christopher's call at 12:37, he could hear something different in Christopher's voice, something excited and hopeful that made his heart skip. Quote 67, Christopher said, and Nicholas could picture the smile on his face. Quote 60, Nicholas sat up in bed, grinning into the darkness. Quote 16, quote side, Christopher said, his voice warm with happiness. Quote 71, Nicholas felt his heart expand with joy, the same feeling he had experienced that first night when Christopher had told him he was falling in love with him. Quote 72, quote 73, Christopher said, and Nicholas could hear him settling back into his pillows. Quote 74, they talked for another hour about their plans, about the life they were going to build together, about how far they had come from those first tentative midnight calls when Christopher had been confused and searching, and Nicholas had been patiently waiting for him to find his way. Quote 75. Christopher said as they were finally getting ready to hang up, the words carrying all the weight of everything they had discovered together. Quote 76. Nicholas replied, smiling as he settled back into his pillows. Quote 79. As Nicholas hung up the phone and closed his eyes, he thought about how much had changed since that first midnight call 3 months ago. Christopher had found himself, had found the courage to love authentically, and Nicholas had found the patience to wait for love to find its way to him. The next morning, Nicholas woke to the sound of his doorbell ringing persistently. He stumbled out of bed, checking the time and seeing that it was barely 7 in the morning, wondering who could possibly be at his door so early. When he opened it, he found Christopher standing there with coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery, his face bright with excitement and love. Quote 78. Christopher said, stepping into the apartment and setting the food on Nicholas's kitchen counter, I wanted to celebrate with you properly, and I wanted to start our day together instead of ending our night apart. Nicholas laughed, pulling Christopher into his arms and kissing him softly. This is perfect. You're perfect. They spent the morning looking at apartment listings online, curled together on Nicholas's couch with their coffee and the laptop balanced between them. Christopher had been right about the place downtown. It was beautiful, with huge windows that let in streams of golden sunlight and a balcony that overlooked the city. Code 81, Nicholas said, pointing at the screen. Code Christopher smiled, leaning over to kiss Nicholas's temple. Our home, I like the sound of that. They called the landlord that afternoon and scheduled a viewing for the next day. As they walked through the empty apartment, both of them could envision their life there together. Christopher pointed out where they could put their books, and Nicholas imagined cooking dinner in the spacious kitchen while Christopher worked at the dining room table. The bedroom gets morning light, Christopher observed, standing in the doorway and looking out at the windows. We could wake up to sunshine every day. No more midnight calls, Nicholas said, coming up behind him and wrapping his arms around Christopher's waist. Quote 87. Christopher leaned back against Nicholas's chest, covering his hands where they rested on his stomach. Actually, I was thinking we should keep the midnight calls, even when we're living together. They're special to us. Maybe we could lie in bed and call each other from across the room just because. Nicholas laughed, pressing his face into Christopher's neck. Quote 89. They signed the lease that day, giddy with excitement in the reality of taking this next step together. Moving in together felt like the natural progression of everything they had built over the past few months. A way of making their love tangible and real in a way that went beyond words and midnight conversations. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of packing and planning and preparing for their new life together. Christopher gave notice at his old apartment, and they spent their evenings sorting through their belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate, laughing at the random things they had accumulated over the years. Quote 90, Nicholas asked, pulling them out of a box in Christopher's kitchen. I don't know, Christopher replied, looking genuinely puzzled. I think they just multiplied when I wasn't looking. We're keeping 3, Nicholas decided, setting aside his favorites and putting the rest in the donation pile. We don't need 17 coffee mugs. But what if we have a party and 15 people want coffee at the same time? Christopher protested, and Nicholas gave him a look that made him laugh. Okay, fine. 3 coffee mugs. You're very practical. Someone has to be, Nicholas said, but he was smiling as he said it, because Christopher's tendency to accumulate random things was just one more thing he loved about him. The night before they were supposed to move into their new apartment, they lay together in Nicholas's bed for the last time, talking softly about their hopes and fears for this next chapter of their relationship. Are you nervous? Christopher asked, his fingers tracing patterns on Nicholas's chest in the way that had become familiar and comforting. Quote, Nicholas admitted. Quote 100. Quote 1, Christopher said. Quote 12. Nicholas smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of Christopher's head. 6 months ago, I was watching you be miserable with Karen and trying to convince myself that being your friend was enough. Now I get to love you out loud, and it's better than anything I ever imagined. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out, Christopher said softly. I'm sorry you had to wait for me. Hey, Nicholas said, tilting Christopher's chin up so he could look into his eyes. 107. Christopher smiled, leaning up to kiss Nicholas softly. Quote 108 or quote 109, Nicholas replied. Quote 110. Moving day was chaotic and exhausting and perfect. Their friends came to help, and Christopher's sister Joyce brought sandwiches and kept everyone fed while they carried boxes and furniture up 3 flights of stairs. By evening, they were surrounded by boxes in their new living room, exhausted but happy. I can't believe this is ours, Christopher said, standing in the middle of the chaos and looking around at their new home. Believe it, Nicholas said, coming up behind him and wrapping his arms around his waist. We did this. We built this together. That first night in their new apartment, they ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes, too tired to unpack properly, but too excited to care. When it got late, they set up their bed and lay together in the dark, looking out at the city lights through their new windows. The midnight calls brought us here, Christopher said softly, his hand finding Nicholas's in the darkness. Would wanted to quote wish on. Nicholas replied, squeezing Christopher's hand. We were always meant to find each other. The calls just helped us get there faster. Christopher smiled, turning onto his side to face Nicholas in the dark. Should we make our first official midnight call from our new apartment? Nicholas laughed, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. That's ridiculous. But you're going to do it anyway, Christopher said, grinning as he reached for his own phone. I'm going to do it anyway, Nicholas confirmed, dialing Christopher's number even though he was lying right next to him. Christopher's phone rang once before he answered. Hello? Hi, Nicholas said, smiling into the darkness. I love you, and I'm so glad we're home. I love you too, Christopher replied, his voice soft and warm through the phone, even though Nicholas could feel his breath on his cheek. Welcome home. They talked for a few minutes, whispering sweet nonsense to each other through their phones while lying side by side in their new bed, and it was silly and romantic and perfectly them. When they finally hung up and put their phones away, Christopher curled into Nicholas's arms with a contented sigh. He murmured against Nicholas's chest, The first of many, Nicholas replied, pressing a kiss to Christopher's hair. The months that followed were a period of settling into their new life together, learning each other's rhythms and habits in a way that went beyond friendship. Christopher discovered that Nicholas was grumpy in the mornings until he had his first cup of coffee, and Nicholas learned that Christopher liked to sing in the shower and left books open on every available surface. They kept up their midnight calls, even though they were sleeping in the same bed every night. It became a ritual of intimacy, a way of staying connected to the vulnerability that had brought them together. Sometimes they would call each other from different rooms of the apartment, just to hear each other's voices through the phone. Sometimes they would lie in bed and call each other while touching, creating layers of connection that felt both silly and profound. Quote 129, Christopher would still tell Nicholas during these calls, and it was still true, even though they were together every day now. Nicholas's voice was still the thing that quieted his mind and settled his heart, the sound that meant safety and love and home. Christopher's therapy was going well, and he was learning to embrace this new understanding of himself without shame or fear. He had come out to his coworkers and extended family, and while there had been some awkward conversations, the response had been largely positive. Nicholas was proud of Christopher's courage, the way he had chosen authenticity over comfort, love over fear. I never thought I could be this happy, Christopher told Nicholas one evening as they cooked dinner together, moving around their kitchen with practiced ease. I spent so many years thinking that there was something wrong with me because I couldn't make relationships work with women. Now I understand that I wasn't broken. I was just looking in the wrong place. Nicholas smiled, reaching over to squeeze Christopher's hand. Quote 32. Their first anniversary as a couple was approaching, and Nicholas had been planning something special for weeks. He wanted to commemorate not just their relationship, but the journey that had brought them together, the midnight calls that had changed both of their lives. On the night of their anniversary, Nicholas prepared Christopher's favorite dinner and set up candles around their living room. When Christopher came home from work, he stopped in the doorway, taking in the romantic scene with a smile that lit up his entire face. "What's all this?" Christopher asked, setting down his bag and coming over to kiss Nicholas hello. "It's our anniversary," Nicholas said, wrapping his arms around Christopher's waist. Quote 135, quote 136, Christopher replied, leaning into Nicholas's embrace. "Best year of my life." They had dinner by candlelight, talking and laughing, and remembering the journey that had brought them to this moment. After dinner, Nicholas pulled out a wrapped gift, something small and rectangular that made Christopher curious. "What is this?" Christopher asked, turning the package over in his hands. "Open it and see," Nicholas said, settling back in his chair with a smile. Christopher unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a small leather journal with their names embossed on the cover. Inside, Nicholas had written out transcripts of some of their most important midnight calls, the conversations that had changed everything for both of them. Christopher flipped through the pages, his eyes growing bright with tears as he read Nicholas's careful handwriting, capturing the words that had brought them together. "Oh, Gordon," Nicholas said softly by quote. Christopher closed the journal and reached across the table to take Nicholas's hand. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me. Thank you." "There's one more thing," Nicholas said, pulling out his phone and dialing Christopher's number. Christopher laughed, understanding immediately, and answered his own phone. Quote water, Nicholas said into his phone, even though they were sitting across from each other. Quote Warshon, quote Forishtam. Christopher replied, his voice warm through the phone and in person. Quote 149. They talked for a while, recreating that first conversation when Christopher had admitted he was falling in love, laughing at how nervous they had both been, how scared and hopeful and uncertain about the future. Now, a year later, they were sure of their love, confident in their choice to build a life together. Quote 150, Christopher said suddenly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Quote 151, Nicholas asked, both through the phone and in person. Quote 150, Christopher said, setting down his phone and reaching into his pocket. Quote 183, Nicholas felt his heart start to race as Christopher pulled out a small velvet box, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. Quote 100, Christopher said, standing up and coming around the table to kneel beside Nicholas's chair. You waited for me to find myself, and then you helped me become the person I was always meant to be. You loved me through my confusion and my fear, and you never once made me feel like I wasn't enough exactly as I was. Nicholas felt tears spring to his eyes as Christopher opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the candlelight. I want to spend the rest of my life having midnight conversations with you, Christopher continued, his voice steady despite the emotion Nicholas could see in his eyes. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a family with you, whatever that looks like for us. Will you marry me? Nicholas felt his heart overflow with joy, the same feeling he had experienced that first night when Christopher had told him he was falling in love, but magnified 1,000 times. Yes, he whispered, then louder. Yes, of course, yes. Christopher slipped the ring onto Nicholas's finger with shaking hands, and then Nicholas was pulling him up for a kiss that tasted like tears and laughter and the promise of forever. Get 160, Nicholas said, laughing through his tears. Get 161, Christopher replied, grinning as he wiped at his own eyes. Wish to 162. They called their families that night to share the news, and everyone was thrilled for them. Christopher's sister Joyce cried and said she had been hoping this would happen, and Nicholas's mother immediately started planning the wedding, talking about flowers and venues and all the details that would make their day perfect. Quote 1 to 63. Nicholas asked later that night as they lay in bed together, Nicholas's new ring catching the light from the street lamps outside their window. I don't care, Christopher said, pressing a kiss to Nicholas's shoulder. Quote Waxstar, quote Wens. Nicholas said, turning in Christopher's arms to face him. I've wanted that since before I even knew it was possible. They spent the next few months planning their wedding, a celebration that would reflect their journey and their love for each other. They decided to have the ceremony in the evening, starting at midnight, as a tribute to the calls that had brought them together. A midnight wedding, Christopher said, grinning as they finalized the plans. Our friends are going to think we're crazy. Let them, Nicholas replied, kissing Christopher softly. This is our story, and we get to tell it however we want. The wedding was perfect, intimate and romantic and uniquely theirs. They exchanged vows under the stars, surrounded by the people who loved them most, promising to love each other through all the midnights and mornings of their lives together. I promise to answer every time you call, Nicholas said during his vows, his voice steady and clear. Whether it's midnight or noon, whether you're scared or happy or confused or certain, I promise to be your safe harbor, your calm in the storm, your home in this world. I promise to keep calling, Christopher replied, his own voice thick with emotion. I promise to share my thoughts and fears and dreams with you, to trust you with my heart, to love you with everything I am for as long as I live. When they kissed as newly married husbands, their friends and family cheered, and Nicholas felt the same sense of rightness he had experienced during that first midnight call when Christopher had told him he felt calmer, hearing his voice. Their honeymoon was spent in a cabin in the mountains, far from the city and the noise of everyday life. They spent their days hiking and reading and talking, and their nights making love and planning their future together. On their last night, they lay together on the deck, looking up at the stars and talking softly about everything and nothing. I still can't believe this is real, Christopher said, his head on Nicholas's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And Nicholas assured him, running his fingers through Christopher's hair. We're real. This love is real. I know, Christopher said, pressing a kiss to Nicholas's chest. Quote 181. Quote 1, Nicholas said firmly. Quote when they returned from their honeymoon, they settled into married life with an ease that surprised both of them. They had been living together for months, but being married felt different somehow, more permanent and secure. They were building something together that would last, creating a foundation for whatever the future might bring. Christopher's career continued to flourish, and he was offered a position that would allow him to work from home several days a week, giving them more time together. Nicholas had been promoted as well, and they were both excited about the financial security that would allow them to think about buying a house and maybe starting a family. What do you think about kids? Christopher asked one evening as they walked through a neighborhood they had been considering, looking at houses with yards and good schools nearby. I think I'd like to have kids with you, Nicholas replied, squeezing Christopher's hand. Who do I say? Quote 7, Christopher said, stopping to look at a house with a swing set in the backyard. Quote, what each? Nicholas smiled, following Christopher's gaze to the house that looked like it could hold all their dreams. I can picture it perfectly. They put in an offer on the house that week, and when it was accepted, they celebrated with champagne and more midnight calls, this time planning the nursery they would set up and the family they would build together. Our kids are going to think we're weird for calling each other when we're in the same house, Christopher said, laughing as they lay in bed that night, phones pressed to their ears. Our kids are going to understand that love comes in many forms, Nicholas replied, including midnight calls between two people who found each other in the dark and chose to build a life together in the light. 6 months later, they moved into their new house, and 6 months after that, they started the process of adoption. It was a long journey filled with paperwork and interviews and waiting, but they supported each other through every step, just as they had supported each other through everything else. When they finally brought their daughter home, a beautiful baby girl they named Hope, Christopher called Nicholas from the nursery at midnight while Nicholas was getting a bottle ready in the kitchen. She's perfect, Christopher said softly into the phone, and Nicholas could hear the wonder in his voice. She's absolutely perfect. She is, Nicholas agreed, looking at the baby monitor that showed Christopher holding their daughter, both of them bathed in the soft light of the nursery lamp. We're a family now. We've been a family since that first midnight call, Christopher replied. Now we're just a bigger family. Hope grew into a curious, happy child who loved bedtime stories and asked endless questions about everything. When she was old enough to understand, they told her the story of how they had found each other, how love had come to them through midnight calls and patient waiting and the courage to be vulnerable. So you talked on the phone, even though you lived in the same house? Hope asked one night as they tucked her into bed. We still do sometimes, Nicholas said, smiling at Christopher across their daughter's bed. Quote 201, quote 2020, Hope said, but she was smiling as she said it. Quote 203. Christopher told her, kissing her forehead goodnight. 2 years later, they adopted a son, a toddler named Gabriel, who had Christopher's curiosity and Nicholas's gentle nature. Their house filled with laughter and chaos and the beautiful noise of a family being built on love and intention and choice. The midnight calls continued, even as their lives got busier and more complicated. Sometimes they were quick check-ins between diaper changes and feeding schedules. Sometimes they were longer conversations about their hopes and fears for their children, their dreams for the future. Always, they were a reminder of how they had found each other, how love had grown from friendship and patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable in the darkness. Christopher would tell Nicholas during these calls, and it was still true, even after years of marriage and children and all the beautiful complications of building a life together. 205. Nicholas would reply, and that was still true too, a promise kept through midnight feedings and sick children, and all the moments when they needed each other most. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows in their backyard, surrounded by their children and friends and family. Hope, now 7, served as the ring bearer, and Gabriel, 5, scattered flower petals with serious concentration. Quote 6. Nicholas said during his vows, looking into Christopher's eyes and seeing all the love and history they had built together, tonight I want to promise you 5 more years, and 5 more after that, and all the years were given to love each other. I promise to keep calling, Christopher replied, his voice steady and sure. I promise to keep choosing you, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day, in the easy moments and the hard ones, for as long as we both shall live. When they kissed, their children cheered, and Nicholas felt the same sense of completeness he had experienced during that first midnight peal when Christopher had told him he felt calmer hearing his voice. They had built something beautiful together, a love that had grown from friendship into marriage into family, a love that had started with a phone call and had become a lifetime. That night, after the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, Nicholas and Christopher lay in their bed and made their traditional midnight call, phones pressed between them as they whispered about their gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't called me that first night? Nicholas asked, his fingers tracing patterns on Christopher's chest. Quote 211, Christopher said firmly. Quote 2 to 12, quote 2 a third, Nicholas said, smiling in the darkness. Quote, "Twaverton," quote, "2%," Christopher replied, pressing a kiss to Nicholas's temple, "and I'm grateful every day that we were brave enough to answer when love called." 10 years after their first midnight call, they were still making them, still finding comfort and connection in the sound of each other's voices. Their children were older now, Hope 17 and Gabriel 15, both of them rolling their eyes at their parents' romantic gestures, but secretly charmed by the love story that had created their family. "You guys are weird," Hope would say when she caught them making midnight calls from the same bed, but she would say it with affection, understanding that this was just one of the many ways her parents showed their love for each other. "The best kinds of love are weird," Christopher would reply, and Hope would smile because she had heard this response 100 times and it never failed to make her happy. Christopher's hair was starting to show gray at the temples, and Nicholas had laugh lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which was often. They had weathered the challenges of marriage and parenthood and building a life together, and their love had only grown stronger and deeper with time. "Utanio," Christopher said one night as they lay together after putting the children to bed, their midnight call ritual as strong as ever. Quote, "220," Nicholas replied, his hand finding Christopher's in the darkness, "but I'm grateful every day that you did." "Me too," Christopher said, squeezing Nicholas's hand. Quote 23. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they threw a party for their friends and family, celebrating not just their marriage, but the community they had built around their love. Their house was full of laughter and music and the warm glow of people who had watched their love story unfold over the years. "Derrière," someone called out as the evening wound down, and Christopher and Nicholas found themselves standing in front of their loved ones, hands clasped together, trying to find words for the gratitude they felt. Quote 225, Christopher began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Quote 26. Quote 27, Nicholas added, his voice warm with emotion. Quote 28, their friends and family applauded, and Nicholas and Christopher kissed as their children pretended to be embarrassed but couldn't hide their smiles. They had built something beautiful together, a love that had started with confusion and uncertainty and had grown into something solid and lasting and true. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were done and the children were asleep, Nicholas and Christopher made their traditional midnight call, lying in their bed and whispering about their gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What do you think the next 10 years will bring?" Christopher asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "I don't know," Nicholas replied honestly, "but I know we'll face it together. I know that whatever comes, we'll have each other, and we'll have these midnight calls to remind us of how we found each other." "I love you," Christopher said, the words carrying all the weight of their history together, all the promises they had made and kept. "I love you too," Nicholas replied, and in those simple words was everything they had built together. A marriage, a family, a home, a love that had started with a phone call and had become a lifetime. As they hung up their phones and settled into sleep, Nicholas thought about the young man he had been 10 years ago, waiting patiently for love to find him, answering every midnight call with hope in his heart. He thought about Christopher, confused and searching, finding the courage to reach out in the darkness and ask for what he needed. They had both been brave in their own ways, and that bravery had led them here, to this bed, this house, this life they had built together. Tomorrow there would be breakfast to make and children to get ready for school, and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. But tonight there was just this: the sound of Christopher's breathing beside him, the weight of the ring on his finger, the knowledge that love had found them both and would keep them safe through all the midnights and mornings yet to come. The midnight calls had brought them together, but it was the choice to keep answering, to keep reaching for each other in the darkness, that had made their love last. And as Nicholas drifted off to sleep, he smiled, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, love was calling to other lost souls, and maybe, if they were brave enough to answer, they too would find their way home.